Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to provide you with the experience, strength, and hope of professionals actively working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. The purpose of our show is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a disease with abstinence as the solution. Here, we talk about all things recovery. Most importantly, how to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, tell others about your change, and hopefully the message will spread.
Hey there, Food Junkies listeners. Molly here. Happy New Year. Clarissa, Vera, and me just wanted to be sure you knew how much we appreciate you. Thanks to you, we've reached 350,000 downloads just in time to kick off our third season of the Food Junkies podcast. I can hardly believe it. Our next goal is 500,000 downloads, and Vera has promised to dance again. Can we do it? Hey, let's get to our guest. Brian Baumal is a registered psychotherapist in Canada who helps people who eat emotionally, binge eat, or have food addiction, just want a normal relationship with food in their bodies, don't want one slip up to lead to an entire binge, purge, or downfall, people who are constantly or obsessively thinking about their weight or food, maybe they've gained or lost hundreds of pounds in their lifetime, maybe they're any weight on the scale, whether in a thinner or heavier body. They may engage or think about binging, restriction, and purging. These people may be pre or post-bariatric surgery or wonder why they jeopardize their health and life. So today, Vera and me find out Brian's personal and professional journey, what are eating disorders versus food addiction, and how he treats clients who have either or both, differences in working with men versus women, our signature question, and more. Take it away, Vera.
Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your co-host today along with Molly Painshaw. Today, we are speaking with Brian Baumal. Brian Baumal is a registered psychotherapist who works at the leading edge of weight management using both the eating disorder and the food addiction models to help his patients regain a functional relationship with food, body, and self-esteem. Okay, Brian, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
All right. So let's get started here. We generally don't deal with people who work with weight management because that's not our focus, but you kind of came into my radar because you were talking about using eating disorder model in the weight management, which is already quite, I'm sure, unique. And then later said that you adopted the food addiction model. So that you kind of got onto our radar and we became interested in your work. So first of all, we always like to start with the personal. So how did you get into the whole business of both weight management, then eating disorder, and then food addiction? And tell us a little bit about your story.
Good question. So one thing I will say about weight management is I have my own history with weight. And I'll get into that in a second. But when I started my practice in this area, I thought, what is a consumer? And I don't even like to use that term per se, but people consume healthcare services. I said, what is a consumer likely to type into their search engine if they want to deal with this? And weight was the first thing that I thought of. So that in part is how I got into weight management. So broadly, I classify people in my own system in three areas. Those who, really have a fairly functional relationship with food, maybe an emotional eater, and just sort of need a push in the right direction. Then there are those with disordered eating and full-blown eating disorders, and I use that paradigm. And then there are those with food addictions. So broadly, that's how I got the term weight. And then I can focus this in on my own experience. Because my own experience involved exercise bulimia, full-blown binge eating disorder, and addictive experience with food. And at the time I was going through all this, I thought I needed help with weight, when in fact I really had exercise bulimia, binge eating, and perhaps a predisposition to food addiction. So all the time my rate was going up and down and up and down. I thought it was a weight problem, and so that's how I really got into the area of weight was thinking about a consumer and then thinking about my own experience with that.
Okay, great. So, I mean, you told me personally that you'd lost up to about 100 pounds, and you've maintained that loss for how long?
10 years, just 10 years and about 5 months and an odd number of days. It started August 15th, 2012 was the day I started to rein this all in.
So I think that one of the benefits, because you see in the same way that we do, that there's sort of three categories, and we're especially interested in that muddle between eating disorder and food addiction. Before we get into all of that, which Molly, I hope you will take over, just tell us, Brian, about, you mentioned you had an enlightening experience about food addiction. Can you tell us about that? Because I'm very curious about what happened.
Yes. So I said my start date in really managing weight, managing my relationship with food and body occurred in August 2012. And I was successful at doing that. And it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about the mindset that got me there. We can talk about that later. But I was successful at managing that. And again, in 2012, I didn't know my practice area would be going in this direction. My training as a therapist didn't involve anything regarding eating disorders, much less food addiction. So I tapered my consumption of sugar, and everyone has to be very different with that. I absolutely recognize that, but that was working for me. But there was a gradual tapering, and around 3 years later, I think it was November 1st, 2015, I had tapered it so much that I said the next logical step is to remove it altogether, like just not have it in my house. That was really the only source of it. So I did it, and it was no problem for me. It could be problems for other people, but I had managed my relationship with food and body in that way that on November 1st, all sugar stopped. Now, about 6 or 7 weeks after that comes the holiday season. And my strategy for the last 3 years had generally been, when I go to a holiday party or a festive occasion, I will eat what I want at the party. There were times where acutely managing my weight, maybe 2 or 3 times or half a dozen times, I resisted a little bit at those, but generally I ate what I wanted to. So that was my strategy going into the December 2015 holiday party. I go in and I have a small chocolate holiday coin, which is about the size of a loonie or a toonie. In Canada, those listening internationally, I'm sure you just put your thumb and middle finger together. That's roughly their index finger together. That's roughly the size of it, very small. And I had an experience that changed my life. All of a sudden, my focus, like my actual eyesight shifted. What was in front of me all of a sudden became blurred, and what was in my background became in focus. And this is often an effect done in horror movies or suspense movies.
What an apt analogy.
Well, I remember it from Jaws and The Shining, at least. I think it's called forced focus. I tried to look up a term for it. But that was the first thing that happened and that I noticed. And then it was must have candy, must have candy, must have candy. My brain was taken over by this. And I guess with the change in perception, I focused on the shortest distance between me and the candy. And in between that was someone who was using a walker or a mobility device. And I had visions of tackling this person, like literally, getting down in a stance and just tackling this person to get to my candy. Now, I avoided that in part because when you train in therapy, you learn to really almost detach from your emotions and process them a bit differently. So I was able to just go, wow, this is a scary and interesting experience. So it lasted for about 20 minutes. And then I sort of came to again. And I was like, that is the scariest experience, or one of the top 10 scariest experiences of my life. And what I want to make this clear, I have had, I probably, like many listeners, I have had tens of thousands of food cravings over my life at that time. I was about, I don't know, maybe late 40s, early 50s. You think about how many cravings you have, especially if have a bad relationship with food, tens of thousands. This was not the number one craving. This was on a completely different level than that was. And then I started telling this story because I was giving speeches about weight management, and I was getting involved in various groups, and I'd be telling this to people. And all the food addicts, people identified as food addicts, would tap me on the shoulder and they'd say, that's me every day.
Right on. Yeah.
Every single day, that is me. And so it was at that moment where I had the experience that food addiction is a real thing. And I had to listen much more carefully to the theory and to the validity of food addiction. But even now in my practice, I still tell that story to people I feel have a food addiction. Some of them break down and cry or cry because I hear it. You're the only person who gets it. Yes, that is what goes on for me. So that was my experience with it. Changed my life forever.
Yeah, Brian, I mean, you really tell our story in that one illustration. And the other thing that you really illustrated nicely is how a craving just lasts 20 minutes. And you were able to, with the skills in place, back off. But boy, did you explain that well.
Thank you. That's exactly what it was. And as I was telling that, people are just listening to me now. I mean, I'm not, my level of awareness in general is probably average in normal situations. I'm not someone that's overly sensitive or overly aware. So it was just such an experience for me. I've never had anything like it before.
Yeah. So having had that experience and then realizing that now you're seeing these clients, I guess I really would love for you to kind of break down for us, like, how do you determine the difference between this is emotional eating, this is eating disorder, this is food addiction? Like, how do you help your clients and maybe you do this together, determine what you're actually working with?
Oh, so that is a fantastic question, Molly. And I can spend a lot of time. Here, and it's probably worthwhile to do. So what I do in my first session with people, almost the first minute of it, is I will do a full detailed food history, and it serves a number of purposes. The first one is to sort of determine what's going on or which paradigm I will use. And the second one, from a therapy relationship, most people, when they go to a provider, have not had the opportunity to spend an hour talking about their relationship with food, their relationship with body, their relationship with self-esteem. So it builds the relationship there. So it's twofold. Now, part of the reason it takes an hour, if not even 2 or 3, is because the similarities between food addiction and eating disorders, and perhaps binge in particular, are what I call annoyingly similar. So I have to spend that time really trying to understand what goes on. So some of the, and I'm open to hearing your input on this as well, but some of the symptoms, if you will, that I consider common to both are things like constant thoughts about food, eating in secret, eating too fast, eating too much, dissociating while eating. Those are about 5 or 6 right there. And then I go a little bit deeper into those, the dissociation. For example, tell me, do you know anything that goes on? Do you get a euphoria that happens when you become aware? What happens again for you? That the dissociation part, I tend to focus on quite a bit. And then I will say, okay, let's say you've had this eating episode, binge, addictive, whatever. What happens the next morning when you wake up? Do you think, is it your first thought, I need to get my fix again? I need to get what I had last night. I need to get this. I need to get that. Or do you go through your normal routine as well? So those are some of the things I begin to look at. And I'm not giving you a particular answer to say, okay, if they fully dissociate and if they're euphoric and if they wake up the next morning thinking they need the food again, that's a food addiction, because it's not, or at least in my view it isn't, but it begins to give me some clues around it. Other things, for example, assessing for volume addiction. Is it just sugar or processed food or a particular food? The example I use, if I put 5 pounds of broccoli down in front of you, will you eat it? Have you eaten food out of the garbage before? Have you stolen your kids' Halloween candy? Because there's a lot of guilt involved in that kind of thing. Those are some other things that I look at. What was the onset of this as well? And what was the relationship with food like with your parents too? Some of the other questions I asked: do you know anyone that's had an addiction, whether it be alcohol, food, gambling, sex, whatever? Is your relationship with food similar to that? Or have you had an addiction before? Is your relationship with food similar to that? So those are some of the things that I begin to look at.
Yeah. So when you're asking all of those questions, I'm thinking about it both from like an eating disorder and a food addiction, right? Like through both of those lenses, do you kind of see these as separate, or are they a continuum? Like, do you see binge eating disorder just progressing into food addiction ever? Or do you see them really as two separate things?
I treat them as two separate things. I've heard the theory, or I've heard some rumblings that there may be a spectrum of it. It's not how I do it, because usually with eating disorders, there is an underlying psychopathology, if you will, around the overvaluation of weight, body image. There could be restriction in the past. There's a lot of psychopathology that underlies that. The other thing too, and this to me is very telling, and this is just my own view, that people who have full-blown eating disorders, full-blown, consider themselves a very bad person for what they do. Their eating, their body image is the reflection of who they are. If they were ever called in front of a court, or if you believe when you pass away and you're judged on stuff, they would say the one thing I will be judged on is my eating and my body type, and so on and so forth.
That I find that a really interesting distinction that I'd not thought about, but boy, does it seem true, because I identify as a food addict. And in my worst days, although I didn't like my weight, what I was much more focused on was how I ate and my shame around that. Mm-hmm. I didn't like the weight, but that wouldn't have been the line in the sand for me. And there you are saying that is. And I think you're right.
We call it, there's a technical term for it, egosyntonic and ego-dystonic opinions of one's self. And it's almost like a computer virus. When the bad thoughts get into your CPU, it becomes exactly who you think you are. So a lot of food addicts will go, the way I eat, what I'm eating is extremely shameful to me. I don't like the way I look. I've tried all sorts of diets, but it may not be 100% of who I am. And again, please be careful with that, because it's possible, it's possible to have both combined together. That's why I do such a detailed history of all this. But thank you for verifying that. It is one thing that I have found.
So, just out of curiosity, Molly, I want you to continue on, because I think it's so interesting. But let me just ask you a quick question. When the guy comes, or the person comes in and says, look, I just want to lose weight, and there you are now getting them to sit through a whole hour of their food and their relationship and on and on. Do they ever balk at that and say, that's not what I'm here for? I don't want a therapist. I want a weight management coach.
Actually, yeah. So sometimes yes, and I'm happy to refer them. And a lot of times what I have found is people will say, you know what, this is more difficult than I thought. There is something really deep that is going on. Let's keep going. But if they do only want, they have a normal relationship with food, they only want a food coach, I can do that. And we work the agreement there. But I will tell people my regulations in Ontario are very specific. I have to assess, but I can't diagnose. So what I say is, I am using the following paradigm to treat you based on my assessment. So I will always let people know what I'm doing with it. And yes, if those who want to lose weight want to go to a food or a weight coach or a dietitian or personal trainer, use me, not use me, absolutely, that's fine. Yeah.
Thinking about like eating disorders, food addiction, do you believe that individuals can self-identify as a food addict, and then does that open up the possibility that we could be self-diagnosing incorrectly? And then what do you do with that?
So I have had, I've been thinking about this for the last couple of hours. I have had some clients or some patients who come in immediately, and I'm actually going to quote one and keep it fairly anonymous. He said, I go to an all you can eat buffet, and I know I am having a different relationship and a different reaction to food than all the other hundreds of people around me. I can tell it. They may not know that I'm reacting that way, but I can tell that I am just putting food in my mouth nonstop. It's robotic, and I am on a complete high or a completely different level. When that is said, I'm like, okay, a big check mark in the food addiction box. The one thing I'm careful of first of all, if somebody self-diagnoses or comes and says I'm this or that, the first thing I will say is, tell me more about that. What makes you think that? That's a typical therapist question to ask. But, that's that sort of different relationship with food is one thing I look for. But what I do a little psychoeducation around, or where I'm a little careful, or where things get a bit difficult, is if someone says, I have one Oreo and then wind up eating the whole box, or wind up eating one row or whatever. What I may say to people is let's use the example of alcohol for just a moment. And let's also realize, or let's make it a given, that packaged food manufacturers are in the business of making money. They're going to make this as palatable as possible so that you can't eat just one. Now, to go to drinking, you can have a drink and wind up having 5 or 6 in total when you didn't plan on it. And we all know that alcohol depresses our inhibitions, it impacts our judgment, and so on and so forth. You have 5 or 6, but you are not an alcoholic, because you wake up the next morning, you have a hangover, and you're like, I'm never doing that again. It's the same with food. So I educate people around that, and then say, where do you think you fall? Are you going to have Oreos the following day? Or is this a pattern that's been going on for years and years? Or is it once a week you have an Oreo and then have the whole box of them? So that's a little how I try and distinguish, or when people self-diagnose. Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds like you just really try to get curious with them and see, like, does that still land if we ask some of these different questions? Right. Is it lighting up your brain like a Christmas tree, or is it something else that we're looking for again? Because like you said, there's that psycho-emotional thing, that really drives more of the eating disorder feeling to it. Though I would argue there is addiction within eating disorders, right? Oh, yeah. I mean, have you experienced that? And can you talk a little bit about what that might look like?
Yeah. So it looks like someone who has an eating disorder, or it looks like someone who can have their trigger foods, and then also have the sort of underlying psychodynamics, such as the preoccupation with weight. They may have done restrictive diets again. Oh, and by the way, this is another assessment that I use. If they've lost a significant amount of weight before and have regained it, what caused the weight regain? Because sometimes I will luck out and hear people say, you know what? I just decided to abstain from sugar. And then 6 months later, I decided to have a cube of sugar in my coffee, and kaboom, I was off to the races again. But there could be restriction in the past. There could be overvaluation. There could be purging. There could be purging as well. There can be restriction for as long as they possibly can. And you get into, you absolutely do get into both. And what I will say at that point, it's a judgment call on where to go first. But I would say, you want to get the underlying psychodynamics, which are maybe more eating disorder related, under control first. But, it all depends.
Right. And Clarissa, who is also a co-host of the podcast, who's not here today, she and I are clinicians in the field as well. And we love working at the intersection of eating disorder and food addiction. And we find that there is this, addiction component within eating disorders as well, where there is, a high when we restrict for as long as possible. There's a high when we binge. There's a high when we purge, right? That there are these kind of, and Vera, I know you can speak a bit more to those chemical reactions as to what's happening. It's not always dopamine, but there are these kind of like neurotransmitters that are just lighting up. And do you want to talk just a bit about what's happening there, Vera?
Yeah, like one of the things that I find so interesting is that even in anorexia, where it's just restricting, that is really, in my mind, Brian, I believe you that there is a distinct entity that's separate, but that there are a lot of people who are either co-diagnosed or misdiagnosed, and they're truly food addicts. I remember even my own experience, just as an illustration, that I started off with restricting, and I got really hooked into the how much more weight can I lose, because it's never enough. And I had a particular weight, and when I reached that weight, it was like, that's actually not good enough. And it wasn't me looking in the mirror. I mean, I looked in the mirror, but it was more about the number, and I wanted to do more. And the high, like you said, Molly, the high of being hungry. This is actually something that I really worry about with the intermittent fasting, like that overplay, because you get an endorphin rush when you're hungry. Like it's a stress response, which then kicks in endorphins. And similarly with binging, which hurts. Like when you're literally in the throes of your 6th round of binging that night, it hurts. But there's an element of just like a person cutting and slashing, there's an element of self-harm, which leads to a endorphin response, which is a bit of a high. So there is actually, in the eating disorder paradigm, the possibility of an addictive overlay or misdiagnosis.
Well, I will say a number of things there. The phrase that I was first taught was that diets, and I know you weren't, I don't want to use that term to describe what happened, but I'll just say, diets lead to eating disorders. That is in my history as well. But what I think the broader phrase really is, changes in your relationship with food can be very dangerous if not managed appropriately. Because you can certainly get that high of, oh my God, I'm thin. I had it as well during exercise bulimia. It's incredible. It's never enough. It's never enough for you. The high of restriction, the high of purging. Purging, what I found, the high there, it can be a psychological high. The other thing too is that people can feel very uncomfortable, physically uncomfortable after a binge. So it's just a physical release. And that physical, the perception of physical discomfort may be fueled by, disordered thoughts as well. But yes, there is very much an addictive component to just changing one's relationship with food. And I will say this, one of the things that I am extremely careful about in my practice is when people start changing their relationship with food, I will not let them get to that point. And as a therapist, you really shouldn't hear a therapist say, I will not let, or whatever. But I want to emphasize how important that is for me, because I believe I will be doing more harm than good if they lose the weight or change a relationship with food, and then I let them go, but they're only eating 800 calories a day.
Yeah.
And they're thinking I can go further. Like you got to intervene.
Yeah. Now, what about this? This is as you were talking, I thought about this. I've had at least 2 people come to me who were like, they wanted to be part of the sugar challenge because they know they ate a little bit too much sugar. And they came to me and they said, you know what, since I've been doing this restricting of sugar, my focus now on food is even more than ever. Like there was that concept of, there was a change in their relationship to food. And they felt that focus, that cessation of sugar actually made them worse. So they both left and said, I don't want to get worse. And that struck me as an interesting phenomenon. I don't usually have people saying that, but were they a normal eater that stumbled in and actually we could have been doing more harm for those people because they were able to abstain on their own once in a while?
It's why the assessment is so important and why we need to continually reevaluate it. I've switched my opinion of people, and I tell them that. I let them know that it's not perfect. I also let them know I'm glad to talk to both of you because we seem to be in agreement on the way I'm proceeding. But I tell people this is my own home brew, if you will. There's no there is the Yale Food Addiction Scale. We're all very familiar with that. One of your previous guests, I think David Wiss, maybe the show that aired last week, had said that he has issues with it. I have the same, and it's a good tool. Don't get me wrong, and it promotes food addiction, but promotes food addiction. But more research is needed. More research is needed so we can be more efficient and accurate with our assessments and know what to do with our clients and patients.
And that brings up such a good point, right? And I think the Yale Food Addiction Scale is this tool that will plunk people into a bucket of food addiction or not food addiction, but it doesn't do a very good job of screening for eating disorders. So we know somebody with active anorexia will absolutely score off the charts severe food addiction with the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And then we have the EDQ, but it doesn't take into consideration food addiction, right? So it just wants to plunk people into that bucket. And so, again, like this is where I love working at that intersection, maybe because I am such a curious individual and I like investigating and I like watching people find what works for them and kind of like buck the system.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was wondering, can you kind of talk to us why it is so critical for us to know the difference between food addiction and eating disorder?
Sure. I mean,
why can't you just say whatever? Let's just go ahead. Why can't we do that?
Okay. I want to hear your opinions on this as well, but it is actually fairly simple. And I boil it down into fairly simplistic components. If you want to add texture to what I'm about to say, feel free. In short, the standard eating disorder paradigm is to have people moderate their foods. In the addictive model, the standard way forward is to have people eliminate. If you cross-connect those, it's a recipe for disaster. If you have a food addict moderate, you're just going to feed the addiction. And if you have an eating disordered individual eliminate, you run the risk of whether it be restriction, compensatory binging later on, you could trigger them into almost, a very dangerous anorexic or restrictive episode. None of us wants that at all in our practice. So that's why it's important to get it right, or to just say, you know what? Let's experiment. After a couple of weeks, after a couple of months, try this, try that, and listen to people and hear what they have to say and what they're doing for themselves. So to really be flexible in the approach. And that's why it's important to know the underlying psychodynamics. If someone really overvalues body image and so on and so forth, you have to really address that. And that may not involve food at all. Why are you doing what you're doing?
Exactly. I mean, I think you nailed it as far as like how Clarissa and I really show up and think about it, working with clients every day, is that this is where harm reduction really is the gold standard. If you're somebody who's working with people who show up and say, hey, I have eating disorder, or hey, I have food addiction, because as you're illustrating, Brian, and this is where I would love to see the research is like, what is the crossover? Like, so that we knew. And I know that there are some stats out there that shows a pretty high correlation between binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa, very high with food addiction, right? And
but
so,
Molly, can you define harm reduction in the context of what you're speaking? You're saying that you're using harm reduction. How so in this context?
Yeah. So in this context, the caveat is always, right, what is the ultimate harm reduction? 0, right? 0 harm would be the ultimate place to be. So it would be abstinence from either those foods that are lighting up your brain like a Christmas tree and causing you problems, or the behaviors, whether it be binging, purging, exercise, bulimia, whatever it might be, but harm reduction says I show up and meet the client exactly where they are. And I figure out what are their goals and how do those align with, gold standard treatment practices, which, as you know, everybody here in the room knows that, we don't have that just yet for food addiction. We're working on it, but we don't have it yet. So what is the gold standard for other substances of abuse, for other process addiction? Mm-hmm. And how can those things apply to this person that's in front of me? Like, what is the tool that I might want to talk to this person about? So harm reduction says, hey, I meet you where you're at. And like Brian was saying, like, maybe this is the person that if I ask them to moderate their sugar intake, it just spins out of control because maybe they truly are, addicted to the pastries or whatever it might be. But maybe I ask somebody to refrain from the pastries and that just, exacerbates their eating disorder because they refrain, and then it's just binge and we can't get them to stop. Now, somebody could show up and say that's food addiction because that looks a lot like food addiction. But again, there's something deeper going on there. It's not the food substance that's lighting up their brain like a Christmas tree. It's more of the messaging and the internalization of what it is that's happening that's driving that.
They're not going to be some of the people that we see in the Facebook group who say, well, it's been a month and I feel fabulous. It's been a month that I've been off sugar and I just feel so good. That's not the person you're talking about.
No. Yeah. So the person we're talking about is somewhere in the middle, right? Where they are an abstainer for some things and moderators for others. Right. That we have to leave room for that gray. Yeah.
I've had clients like that. I'll speak generally. There are some people who are addicted to fast food or soda in particular. And once they abstain from that, they can moderate other areas. I've seen that many times before. And in terms of weight reduction, if you want to get into that, I don't know if we want to go down this road or not, but it puts them in good stead for the bariatric surgery process if they can change the addictive relationship with food prior to the surgery process. And the surgery process can help further moderate, or if they understand what's addictive and what they need to moderate.
So in that, thinking about that, then, do you work with clients where you guys talk about abstinence is the best approach for that person? Does that ever occur?
Absolutely. I do. I'm just running through my roster for a number of them. And it's just a matter of trying to figure out their trigger foods and then having them abstain from them. Absolutely. There are some where I say abstinence is what you have to do, or it's something that we work towards. It's something that I need you to watch for. It's something, let's try it for 2 weeks, then go back on and see what happens. Yes, there are some for whom abstinence is fundamentally it. And in other cases, it's abstinence from some things, moderation with others, or, just once you repair that relationship with food, that may be a success. They may say, I'm happy. I don't need to change my weight or anything like that. I'm good where I am.
Molly, can I ask a question that's outside of the eating disorder? Because we might want to come back to that, but it's something that it keeps coming in my mind. Am I right in understanding, because I know you through Tony Vasello, who works mainly with men and their partners, that you have probably a higher percentage of men clients than I might see. And so enough anyway, can you give a description of what some of the gender any dynamic with either addictive foods or how you would approach them?
I do probably see a higher proportion of men. That's for sure. I would say if we're just focusing on food addiction, the shame that men have around the food addiction appears to be greater than women. Just the shame around the eating that is uncontrollable for them. But I really do have to say this, and this is maybe another podcast or maybe even a different podcast entirely from where we are. The pressure on women to look a certain way is unfreaking believable. It's not my own personal opinion, but as a therapist, I hear it all the time. And what happens if I lose weight? And what are my relationships going to be like? I hear it all the time. I don't hear it from men in quite the same way. It is an incredible dynamic. I know it's not necessarily a food addiction issue the way men and the guilt seems to be there, but boy, is it an issue in general.
Can you give an illustration of what you mean when you say men have a lot more shame than women around their eating? Like, give me an illustration, because I'm not a man. I'm like, wow, really? I thought women did. So enlighten me here.
I think with food, I think with food addiction, yes, there is this sense that I should be in control. I should be able to manage. I'm in control of my emotions. I am a male, and in fact, I am not. And the guilt around that can be very, very, very significant, because men generally speaking, men are rational human beings, not given to emotion, calculating, upright, if you will. So the shame there tends to be magnified a little bit as a result, I would say. Even needing food to cope. Why do I need this to cope? I hear a little bit more from men than women. These are really finer points. I would suspect that if you did a survey around this, I don't know the statistical differences that would exist in what I'm saying, but
might that explain why men don't come? Like, we have an abundance of women seeking help, but not so many men. Is that maybe why? The shame of that? And
I think in part the shame, yes. I think in part I can handle this on my own. I don't need a Facebook group for God
forbid, a therapist.
Yeah, for this, and I can do this on my own. And again, I think you could. I haven't viewed your Facebook. I recommend your Facebook group. I haven't viewed it recently in a lot of detail, but again, I wonder how many of the participants are driven in part by appearance around that. Now, appearance is a factor. Let's not say that it isn't. But we're talking about differences between males and females. Are what percentage are overvaluing the appearance aspect?
Yeah, I wonder too with the men. I think that there's a lot of the way that men groups, and again, now I'm painting in broad brush strokes. Like, I'm talking in generalization and like in these kind of like stereotypical gender groups, right? Mm-hmm. I think in my experience being around, initially that was my field, is I worked with men in corrections, in other substance use disorders, right? In violent relationships, that kind of thing. And so to be now in food addiction and eating disorders, that intersection, and being with mostly women, it is really interesting to me. But I think when it comes to the food, for me, my experience has been men have a different way of communicating with each other, right? So they'll give each other a hard time. They'll, razz each other, or they'll make jokes about it. Like, how many tacos can I, right? Like they really show up in a different way. Meanwhile, on the inside, I think it is painful, but they're more likely to kind of go to the more, like, in my experience, it's like they go, like, I see it happen, right? They show up at the MMA gyms or the local gym, and I'm going to take on boxing, and I'm going to take on weightlifting, and I'm going to take on these things, right? And they like really kind of bro out, it's like, I'm going to get my nutrition dialed in, and it's going to be this very specific way. Meanwhile, never really addressing that underlying emotional issue, biological chemical dependency issue, whatever it might be. But I do think that because of that, like you were saying, Brian, like almost like that stoicism or that like upstanding, whatever, right? Like, men can really just dig in my experience, and just like ignore the pain and just like push on that pedal and just go, right? Like, I'm just going to lift as heavy as I can lift. I'm just going to run as far as I can run, whatever it is. And they can really shut that down for whatever reason. So
Brian, what kind of treatment, like, do you have a different approach then as a result between
for men and women? I'm going to focus more on the appearance aspect of things. And what I tell women is, and again, please jump in. It's even hard for me to say this. It's too bad we're not on video because my face has changed entirely when I say, unfortunately, there is some truth to what you're saying. And I actually say it pains me as a male to even say that there is some truth, because I don't want to perpetuate. But it's something that we have to work on navigating together. And what I encourage first and foremost is pride in who you are as a person more than anything else. And then oftentimes people will say, but my pride and appearance are they're so related, or do I have to get pride before I get appearance, or so on and so forth. And then I turn just to inhabiting one's body. What's it like to be directly in your body? Stand up, be proud now. And that's hard. Very hard for people to do. I will tell you one of my own experiences that may be worthwhile. So when I started changing my relationship with my body, about 5 or 6 months in, I hadn't, I lost weight at 1 to 2 pounds a week, was not crazy in any way. So I hadn't, lost a lot of weight, hadn't really changed my relationship, but I'm in with food, but I'm in the gym doing bicep curls. And just for me, I get an endorphin rush from doing resistance training. So I'm in there doing these bicep curls, and I get this endorphin rush as I'm doing them. And I realize that as I'm doing this endorphin rush is completely independent of my weight. I could walk into this gym at 150 pounds and do this, or I can walk in at 350 pounds, 400. It does not make a difference to me, this feeling that I'm getting. And from that moment on, I inhabited my body, and I actually said, I do not care if I lose another pound or not, because this is the feeling that I want. This is it. It was so powerful to me. And sometimes people will ask me, they'll say, okay, well, why didn't you stop your weight loss? I'll say, you know what? Because that allowed me to go a little bit further and just say, what more can I do here? Because the underlying thought was, if I fail at doing something else, I'm going to return to a place that I like.
So profound, to have that experience. And it's almost like so freeing, right? Because once you say it doesn't matter if I lose another pound, this is the thing that I want. This is the feeling that I want. You start doing things that get you closer to that. And it's amazing. Like, that's recovery, right? Because then the rest of it follows along.
Absolutely.
You're paying attention to like the important piece, right? I always had these clients that would say, blood alcohol content, or, sobriety is a blood alcohol content and recovery is a spiritual blood content kind of deal. And that, that experience sounds very spiritual in that aspect. And like, just when we can get to that place, when we embody, when we come back into ourselves and go, yeah, this is it, then we can move forward. That's the freedom. It was so bloody profound for me. And that's where we want to get to with people. I can stand up and be proud that I am treating myself in a way that just makes me feel good. It helps with depression. It helps with sleeping. It gives me an endorphin rush. This is what I am here for. And that is it. The focus was right off of weight. Yeah. And I will say this, it just happened to me. Now, at that time, I had gone through my therapist training. I was a therapist, and we sort of know that therapy kind of works. We have to, hopefully what we do is shuffle the deck correctly in people so that they're able to experience these things when they happen. But it's impossible or very, very difficult for a therapist to push and say, for these kind of enlightenment to happen. We can say, the next time you go to the gym, notice, do you get that? Yeah, I do get that. But for this enlightened response to have happened, it is almost a random event where the therapist just really has to try and keep shuffling the deck over and over
again.
Yeah, keep planting the seed and keep asking, like, what do you notice? And like allowing ourselves into it. Because again, folks, like if it doesn't matter if this is eating disorder or food addiction, we are seeking relief, or we're seeking that disconnection. Honestly, like it sounds really counterintuitive, but we are. I mean, the eating disorder and the food addiction are disconnection, and we're actually seeking that from our emotions, from our thoughts, from something inside of us that just does not feel right. And so this process that Brian is talking about is like coming back into, and not just noticing that experience, but like connecting it back together and like coming back to our higher self for sure. So Brian, I feel like you're right. We could have a whole nother episode. We could go on for another hour. Unfortunately, we just don't have that time. So we're going to, so I would love to know what's next for you.
Wait a second, can we find out about the resistance? Brian, in the work that you've done, because you're, come from the weight management field and then incorporated eating disorder, have you had any resistance from other colleagues, or are you kind of working on your own there?
Yeah, no. So the resistance is from, let's say, other psychological providers around the notion of food addiction. So the answer to that is unfortunately yes. I've had about 5 or 6 that I've counted. One as recently as the fall of I guess 2022. And what I often hear is things like abstinence causes an addictive like rebound in people. And here's what I say to that. There are many providers who work in obesity or weight or food addiction. You've got physicians, you've got occupational therapists, physiotherapists, nurses, et cetera, et cetera. For those that are in the psychological realm, like psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and those professions that practice therapy, here's what I say. A therapist's primary job is to listen better to the client and perhaps other people have in their life. If you do nothing else as a therapist, if you just listen better or differently to whatever they're talking about, trauma, problems with their marriage, problems with work, whatever, if you just listen, you're doing about 2/3 of your job right there. So what I want to tell people whose job it is to listen is that if you listen to how some people describe their relationship with food, it does not fit squarely into into the eating disorder paradigm. It doesn't. When you listen that carefully, like my client who said, I know I'm having a reaction that is different than everyone around me in the restaurant. I know I am getting so high on this stuff. That could, maybe it could be, but, really, if you listen very carefully and if you use empathetic listening and transference and countertransference to understand the emotionality behind it.
Well said, Brian. Molly.
But, so that's what I say. If you listen carefully, some of this is not going to be explained by eating disorders alone.
So I interrupted Molly. We want to close up that we want to still get a little bit more out of you. What is next for you, Brian?
So my practice is full, thank God, which is a good thing. So what is next is looking at expanding and growing it. So in the new year, I'm looking at bringing on a couple of other therapists who practice in the food addiction paradigm, who have lived experience, because I have lived experience with all of this. So building out to a group practice, also offering some group courses. Maybe you can save time by educating people the difference between eating disorders, food addiction, or how they're related before they see a therapist. So just having people understand that knowledge, some courses around guilt and shame around eating. And then possibly I've started looking at it, writing a book, which is really daunting. So that is what's next for me.
That's amazing. Well, before you go, we have a signature question for all of our guests. So if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about eating disorders, emotional eating, volume addiction, food addiction, what would it be?
I think it would have to be around watch your self-esteem. I had very low self-esteem for a long time and didn't know it, because you can overcompensate. You can be excellent in some areas and think that you overcompensate, and think that you're doing really well. And so just watch your self-esteem, which I now define as not letting myself get into bad situations in any part of my life, or not say, I'm going to achieve at work and I can let my health slide. No, I can't. Like when I say I'm thinking of writing a book and thinking of expanding my practice, my primary goal is my health and my relationship with food, and my relationship with my son and my family. I've asked my son, I said, should I expand my practice? What do you think? So not getting into trouble there. So watch your self-esteem is what I would say.
Right on. Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for being part of this. You spoke very eloquently about some of the muddle between eating disorder and food addiction. And thank you.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. You've helped in your questioning. You helped separate the muddle, which is what I think. It's not so much separating the muddle, but how all of this can work together in a methodical way that serves all of our clients and patients as best as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies, Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life support group, I'm Sweet Enough. You can subscribe to our show in iTunes or Stitchers. That way you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. Don't forget to pick up your copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies, which is available on Amazon. If you have any additional questions, both Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals and work one-on-one with clients. You can find their websites and email addresses in the show notes. Be sure to tune in every Friday when our new episodes drop. As Vera loves to say, the power is ours.